This episode contains discussions of sexual violence, trauma, and systemic injustice. Some content may be distressing or triggering, especially for survivors. Please listen with care and prioritize your well-being. Support resources are listed in the episode description below.
So I'm Dr. Jill Andrew. Very honored to be a part of this conversation. Thank you, Juelene, for your incredible work and for your ability to make me also feel very comfortable addressing an issue like intimate partner violence and gender-based violence that is often difficult to talk about, but that we need to name and we need to address. I'm a child and youth worker. I'm a teacher. I most recently was a member of Provincial Parliament where I represented my home community of Toronto St. Paul's. I did that for 7 years. I'm also a writer, a speaker, an academic. Before politics, not only was I in our public school system, but I had also ventured into our post-secondary system where I was a lecturer at a university as well, outside of all of the speaking engagements I would do in some of our local colleges, universities, and community organizations. And really, I came to the work of intimate partner violence, gender-based violence, not only as a survivor of sexual assault, sexual abuse as a child, but also as an MPP. And it was a great honor to serve as the NDP official opposition's critic, or now shadow minister, they're calling it, for women's social and economic opportunities. And it was there that I really had a chance to meet with hundreds, if not thousands, frankly, of survivors, of allies, of organizations, of frontline workers, of previous politicians. So many people I got to meet with to really hash out some of the key needs in this sector to be able to really support, uplift and amplify women and girls and children and 2S LGBTQIA plus community members, members with disability, women with disability, our seniors who are disproportionately impacted by various forms of gender-based violence.
I definitely applaud and appreciate your emotion, because I feel like that is what people need to feel and hear, to know that there are advocates, there are people in positions of power who are trying very hard. It's not just numbers, pieces of paper. They feel very seriously and very deeply about wanting to see progress. So, I mean, as a community worker myself, I'm not in some of these more, I think, important spaces and decision-making spaces, but I do know that advocacy plays a pretty decent role in driving for change. However, as you've just discussed, advocacy can't do everything. So, what can we as society, what can we do as community workers, what can maybe more nonprofit organizations do to sort of influence the legislative process and to keep, pushing? Because as you said, it hasn't quite changed. It is an ongoing struggle. What can we do to keep pushing? And also not just, quote unquote, the outside, but again, you touched on burnout, and, there's a real need for self-care. So while we want to find ways to keep pushing, how can we do that in a way that keeps people from feeling like, okay, I'm being motivated, I have to do everything I can do, but I have no gas in my tank?
Yes. And I tell you, that's a big one. First and foremost, I want to start by saying, Juelene, there is no just, your work on the front lines is just as important as those who are elected and the decision makers, right? Because frankly, change does not happen without the folks who are on the front lines, without the nonprofit organizations, again, usually staffed by women, disproportionately staffed by women, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. So there's no just in the equation. We're all part of the solution. And really what folks need to do is get in touch with their members of provincial parliament, get in touch with your member of parliament, speak to them, go into their constituency offices and demand the change you wish to see. That's a big big animal, some may think,
Mhm.
but really it can be as small as starting a petition in your community around some of those things that I raised earlier, like Bill
Mhm.
173. Let's get intimate partner violence declared an epidemic. We put forth that legislation when I was an elected MPP over a year ago, and we've demanded that that be declared over and over and over in the legislature. And I can tell you, it was not declared. It hasn't been declared, even though the government said that they were supportive of it.
Mhm.
It hasn't happened. What's happened is many studies. The government has done studies and committee hearings on intimate partner violence, on gender-based violence, listening to survivors and organization leaders and frontline workers. And no disrespect, it's important to hear them.
Yeah.
But they've been telling us the same thing over and over and over again. And there's a level of burnout that survivors and organizations and frontline workers and allies get when they keep banging their head against the wall, demanding the same things. Whether it's the funding that needs to happen, sustainable funding, not the piecemeal funding that's happening in our organizations, whether it's the passing of Bill 173, whether it's the reckoning of how programs like the government's Victim Quick Response Program or their dismantling of, what was it called? The Compensation Board, how that has put back survivors who can't get access to things like therapy or massage, because of the exorbitant prices, right? So we have to be able to look at the system and recognize the gaps and see what's falling through. So creating lobby days. I mean, when I think of OATH, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, and how good they are at bringing organizations to the table, at Queen's Park, having meetings with decision makers at Queen's Park around the issue, the YWCA, Counterpoint, various organizations are good at being heard, right? We need to do more of that. And we don't need to wait for days of significance to raise IP and GBV issues, because we know that femicide, I think I heard that's increased about 70% in the last while. And I mean, one murder of a woman, girl, or gender diverse person simply because of their gender is one murder too many, in my opinion, right?
Absolutely.
So we don't have to wait for November 25th. We don't have to wait for special days in the calendar year to make this a voting issue, to make it a policy urgent issue, a public health crisis issue to our decision makers at Queen's Park. So lobbying is important. Making phone calls to your elected officials, that's important. As I used to say to organizations, collect as many stories as you can from survivors and share these stories. And let us remember, it's not just the survivor of violence who is impacted, the direct survivor. And sometimes we don't have survivors. Sometimes people, as I said, are murdered. It's their families. It's the mothers left behind. It's their colleagues at work. It's the general community that has a loss of a loved one when someone is taken away well before their time through femicide or through intimate partner violence. So we have to consistently be vocal about our demands, whether it's funding, whether it's passing legislation. I mean, the word femicide needs to be included in the criminal code. Now, this is not something that the provincial government can do, but, as MPPs, they can certainly sound the alarm to their Member of Parliament counterparts to get this done. Because we know that if femicide is not mentioned in the criminal code, if we're not looking at the intersectional realities of violence against women and how that differently impacts Black women, Indigenous women, women who are in poverty, disabled women, trans women. We have to name it. We have to be able to discuss the hate, frankly, and the misogyny and the stereotypical tropes and the gender roles, all of the boxes that certain women are placed in, certain people are placed in, that are harmful, that help perpetuate this idea that, women are objects. And therefore objects, aren't human, and they can be dehumanized, and they can be victimized. We have to address it in our criminal code, Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to say. I think I had said this earlier. I know I had seen a note that the recording wasn't happening. So I'm trying to say things that I said already.
I appreciate that.
We need at least a 30% increase in funding to our rape crisis centers and our sexual assault centers. We cannot keep doing piecemeal funding. Every organization I've spoken with, survivors I've spoken with who found their new chapter of life courtesy of a worker from an organization, has said, if these places are not properly funded, healing, prevention, recovery, none of that is possible. Our shelters are bursting at the seams. We have to reckon with the need for real affordable housing, nonprofit housing, co-op housing, rent control, for goodness sakes, so that when survivors are thrust back into the market value homes, they're not paying through the roof. Because guess what? We're also struggling with pay equity. We're still struggling with the reality that women are not being paid the equal value of their work than men, right? Black women, Indigenous women, the stats are even worse. Trans women, the stats are even worse. So if we don't have real affordable housing, and we have survivors trying to get back, on a better path for themselves, one that's free of violence, and they cannot afford to pay their housing, this opens the door to them having to return to unhealthy, possibly violent home situations, right? So we have to address these things as well.
You're absolutely right. Addressing the gender-based violence really does mean that survivors need the right supports in place, like immediately. And I think when I hear you talking about, again, funding and the different types of views that people, society in general does have of women, it sort of answers the question why there's not more funding, and why a lot of the time it doesn't go further than it should. It gets sort of, to use the term that's often used for women, a glass ceiling, where you escalate, as you mentioned, there's conversations happening, there's studies happening, and a lot of these things cost money, and that money could be redirected into direct supports for survivors. It's obviously a deep-rooted social issue. And so from maybe a policy perspective, what more can governments do? You're talking about the word femicide, making that, a very clear criminal sort of a word to enforce criminal justice. And I can speak from a group of people. I recently graduated from my community worker program. We used that word in the class, and many people had never heard it before. And I can guarantee I can go down and talk to 3 of my neighbors, and 2 of 3 are probably going to be like, well, I don't know what that is. And then there's this idea of making words up. You're just using that word you just threw that together. But I shouldn't say nobody, but people are not taking the time to really investigate what that means, how it affects society, how it affects women, and possibly how it affects them, because each of us is, I wouldn't even say 6 degrees of separation. Each of us is possibly 2 degrees of separation from somebody who's experiencing gender-based violence right now. And as you said, we were talking about the work being done by women. A lot of the women are doing this work through lived experience. So it's triggering for them as well. There may be something, of course, that makes you feel good and pushes you and motivates you to want to help others because you know what it's like. But there's no way that it's not affecting your spirit, your emotions, your mental health as you sort of are opening yourself back up to what you've possibly been through, what you know that someone else has been through, and then guiding and supporting someone who's going through it now, recently gone through it, possibly is facing an unsafe situation. And it is very difficult to understand what what is not happening. We know what needs to happen. You're talking about some things that are not happening, but understanding the why, I think, is very difficult. And how can the government not take responsibility and respond to victims and survivors? How can they how can they specifically work towards preventing it from happening in the first place? Because again, we're talking about the needs and the supports that should be in place, not only for survivors, but to prevent these situations.
And the thing is, the government will tell you, the government of the day here in Ontario will tell you, oh, we're addressing it. We're doing everything that can be done. But I'm here to tell you the Renfrew County Inquest recommendations, 68 of the 86 recommendations fall within the provincial jurisdiction. That means that the buck stops with the Premier of Ontario, right? One of the top ones, declare intimate partner violence an epidemic. Ensure there's funding for real affordable housing. Ensure we have a working, functional, equitable, properly resourced criminal justice system, right?
Yeah.
Ensure there's better education around gender-based violence. I mean, this is not rocket science. It can and should be done, right? Ensuring that decision makers, that people in the justice system have trauma-informed training, so that, again, as I had said at the top of the hour, survivors aren't being re-victimized while fighting for justice by the very people who are supposed to help them, who are supposed to believe them. Ensuring that we've got 10 days of paid leave for women escaping violence. Ensuring that if they have to take more time, that they're not consequenced in the workplace. There are these arbitrary numbers, right, that are placed on workers. Like the number of paid sick days one can get.
Yes.
Nobody knows except your doctor when exactly you may be better. And our bodies are not all the same. Someone may not be well in 3 days or in 7 or in 8. You may not be placed in a safe home yet in 10 days. Yet we have these numbers that people have to pretzel themselves to fit into. Otherwise, there are economic consequences. And really, when you are a survivor trying to escape violence, oftentimes with your dependent, with your little child on your back or underneath your arm, the last thing you need to have to worry about is, oh my God, where's the doctor's note? Or, oh my goodness, if I'm not back in 7 days or in 2 days or in 6 days. These are issues that we can't have survivors having to deal with on top of trying to rebuild their social, emotional, economic, their physical and mental lives. We just can't have that. We can't. So we need a government to believe our survivors. We need a government to properly fund the very frontline organizations that are supporting survivors, that are doing the work 24/7. I've heard from workers, Bill 124, we won't have time to get into that, but that wage suppressing bill, it impacted frontline healthcare workers. It impacted women. Yes, the bill was overturned, but some of those workers still haven't seen their money, right?
Yes.
So we need proper funding to the organizations, to the workers. We need survivors to have access to real affordable housing. We need to have a healthcare system that's robustly funded, so that when, not if, when you need access to a family doctor, when you end up as a survivor in the ER, it's not a 24-hour wait. It's not a 2-year wait for a family physician. All of these pieces, if we think about it, if they're properly funded, if they're properly staffed, it actually helps save the province money.
Right.
It saves the money. If organizations that do the life-saving work of supporting survivors of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, if they're properly funded, they can build critical mass. They can do capacity building. They can do succession planning. So it's not a matter of, oh, the project's over, the funding's gone, now we've got to let go of that staff. Built strong relationships and has earned the trust of survivors in said program, and poof, it's gone. And we hope to get funding in the next fiscal cycle. This is not helping anyone. Now, I'm not saying that those project fundings, I mean, the piecemeal funding, if that's all you're getting, obviously it's making a mark on someone's life. I'm not downplaying that, but I'm just saying if we are to have truly sustainable long-term funding, it needs to start with better operational budgets, operational funding for organizations. Those who are helping survivors across the board need to be properly staffed. It's not hard. None of this is rocket science. The funding is there. The budgets are there. I remember one of the last budgets I sat through that the government announced had not a single mention of supportive or transitional housing. Not a single mention, right? So this is what I mean. Like, we have to understand the problem. We have to understand the problem. We have to name the problem, and politicians need to have the political will to make the policies happen. You know, if folks can come up with billions of dollars for fantasy tunnels, for greenbelt grabs, for this, for that, for all kind of backdoor deals, we should be able to come up with money to support women and children and some of the most made marginalized people in our community. We have to be able to help them, because if we can't, then that's a collective failure. And I think it's a failure that just cannot happen, especially now in these times. You know, everyone's talking about tariffs, everyone's talking about the economy, right? Well, feminist recovery, you know, supporting women, ensuring they can put food on the table, ensuring they don't have to stay with an abusive partner, that they can hold their own and pay their own bills. That's part of also having a strong economy. I think so.
I agree with you 100%. You touched on something earlier that I just want to speak to briefly, which was sort of the work situation and the time off and the doctor's notes. And I think many people, male and female, but I beg to say, women especially, have had those days where they can't pinpoint something that is specifically physically wrong, but they just don't have it. And not in the way where, you know, you're laughing with your girlfriend, you say, girl, not today. No, in the way that you can't get out of bed. You cannot function. You can't take care of your children in the house. And yet there's no doctor's note for that. And if there was more leniency in the workplace to say that, you know what, I can feel okay, I can feel safe, I can feel comfortable to call in today without having to create a lie, without having to dig deep for some excuse, to be able to just say, unfortunately, I will not be in today.
Well, you're talking about mental health, really, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, we live in a society where, you remember that saying? I remember a saying that we would say as kids, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is one of the worst statements. It's one of the worst phrases. And ironically, it was meant to empower. It was meant to get through. But the truth is, what it did is it told us that physical scars matter more than invisible scars. You know, it told us that physical violence should be taken more serious than the emotional abuse, than the financial abuse that some women are dealing with, who have never been touched, but who have been broken down, you know, who have been crumbled into dust through words, right? And you're right, because we don't address mental health in the robust way that we need to, you know, there's still folks in Ontario who can't afford to see a therapist.
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
You're left curled up in bed. You're left stuck, because there's not enough access to mental health supports. I remember this current government, one of the first things they did when they were elected all the way back 7 years ago was cut, I don't know, $300 or so million in mental health supports. That was tough. That was tough to witness, knowing that we were seeing an increase in mental health challenges in our kids in schools, in post-secondary students having to deal with violence and harassment in the workplace. And not even workplace. That my bad. I made a mistake, a slip of the tongue. On campus, for goodness sakes, right? So there's so much work that has to be done. On the note of campus as well, there's also something I remember a colleague of mine had put forth. I believe it was a motion to have the student loans erased. Well, not the student loans, sorry. To have the debts erased from human trafficking survivors. Human trafficking survivors, including their student loans even, are financially abused by perpetrators.
Yeah.
And they're left with thousands of dollars in debt. This is something that needs to be addressed, because again, if we're talking about not only supporting survivors, we're not only talking about prevention and intervention, but recovery, the ability to get back to a place where you're feeling whole again, it has to involve economic liberation. It has to involve economic liberation. That is not to say that women who have financial means are not targets of intimate partner violence. I do not want to say that. That is not the case. But we know that when you do not have access to your own economic liberation, to your own economic freedom, it can place you, or it can keep you in a situation of violence, right? I didn't talk about our seniors. I mean, I remember meeting with stakeholders who talked to me about seniors and seeing increases in violence against seniors, including financial violence and abuse. So, that's why we need advocates. I remember a former colleague of mine, Dr. Laura May Lindo, had put forth legislation for a seniors advocate, an independent seniors advocate, to champion for our seniors, not someone that's attached to some political party, but someone whose sole work it is to protect our seniors, right? We need advocates at all ends. We need organizations to step into their role, step into their power, and meet with members of provincial parliament, meet with members of parliament, fight to get femicide included into the criminal code, demand IPV be declared an epidemic, demand the funding that's necessary to do the work and the staffing that's necessary to do the work. And we have to have a real reckoning with our justice system, because sadly, our justice system is not working for the very people who are seeking justice. It's not working well enough, I should say. It's not working well enough. And again, one woman killed through femicide, it's too much. You look at the Canadian Femicide Observatory, you look at OAIF stats, and these are stats, these are a snapshot in time. We know that there are Indigenous missing women and girls that are not accounted for in that. We know that because femicide is not used across our nation, right? There are cases that are not being named exactly what they are. And when they're not named, we can't do data research. We can't make the case for why we need more funding to address femicide or intimate partner violence or gender-based violence. So I think I may sound like a broken record, but the answers are there. And what we do not need in Ontario are more rounds of committee hearings. We don't need to hear. We don't have to re-victimize survivors. We don't need to take the understaffed, burnt out frontline worker from the organization that needs them to come to Queen's Park to prove yet again that there needs to be sustainable funding and operational funding for organizations. Like, we just don't need to keep doing this wheel. But sadly, some politicians are very good at performance, and sitting through the meeting in the fancy committee room with the cameras rolling, it looks like work's getting done, as opposed to simply passing the bills, opening the wallet, and getting the funding and getting the resources, and believing women when they speak, whether they're survivors, whether they're workers, whether they're CEO and presidents of organizations, whether they're the psychologists, whether they're the law enforcement officials, whether they're the judges or whoever it is that is saying, look, we're being inundated with cases, and we don't have the resources to support these, and cases are being stayed. And people are not getting their day, and I don't know if there's ever a thing as 100% healed. I don't know about that, right? I can tell you, as a survivor of sexual assault, of sexual abuse, it stayed with me. It has stayed with me.
Yeah.
But because I had a mother who believed me, because I was able to access supports, namely therapy. We don't talk about therapy enough in some communities. Yes. It's a taboo topic. We're just to, give it to the Lord in prayer. Well, guess what? The Lord's doing a lot of work. So we got to help the Lord out sometimes. And that means speaking to a psychologist too. There's nothing wrong with accessing mental health supports, but it stays with me, and it stays with many survivors. But the more resources we can get, the more help we can get, the stronger we become as individuals and as a collective. The more information we have, the more we can shift the narrative at the curricular level in our schools. We can address rape culture. We can address online bullying. We can address the over-sexualization of our girls in our schools, which again disproportionately impacts Black girls, who are often adultified. They're often consequenced in ways that non-Black students aren't, for the same behaviors. Some of our kids are acting out because they are witnessing violence. Yes. Right? So we need wraparound services. Like, we need to get this right. And it is a public health crisis. And I wish to God that more politics could see the value in cross-partisan work. If a good idea comes from the opposition, which happens to be the NDP, run with it, take it. Don't turn your eyes away from it because it's the NDP. If a good idea comes from the PCs, or a good idea comes from the Liberals, or a good idea comes from the Greens, or, just think about the people who you're there to serve. Yeah. And put forth the bills and pass the bills and pass the motions. I don't know how many times. I remember last year, I believe it was in April, there were hundreds of survivors, Juelene, hundreds of survivors at Queen's Park when we tried to pass the intimate partner violence bill. Right. And it was flattened. There was another bill, Lydia's Law, that was put forth by another member of Provincial Parliament, Catherine Fights, I believe it was. So many survivors, are in the halls, they're in the building. Yes. And then politics happens, and the government silences the debate. Right. And these women who have traveled, from all across the province, leave feeling defeated. Absolutely. Right? And this is what happens when partisanship and politics wins. Yeah. So the more that we can talk about this, the more we can organize, the more we can work across the lines, and that includes sectors and organizations, because I know organizations are fighting for the same tiny funding pool, and that can sometimes bring fraught relationships, even within the sector doing this God-saving, health-saving, life-saving work, right?
Yes.
We got to do better. We got to do better. We got to do better.
You touched on so many good things there. A part of the theme of this podcast is collaboration. And just as you're ending there with, even within the sector, agencies being able to work together as opposed to ruffle each other's feathers, because there is a small amount of funding, you're right. But also trying your best to collaborate with government, because again, how do you know as an agency, or even, just as an advocate, what funds are available? Where is the transparency there? So again, we don't want to say, take on more work. You're at the maximum, you're here, take on more work. But in order to do the work, it sometimes means pushing a little bit to be, I don't want to use the word proactive because it makes it sound like, well, you're not doing anything otherwise, but
Right.
How do you find out? How do you arm yourself basically to go in and say, listen, I know that there's this much money. We here want some of it. And whether it is collaborating as several agencies and saying, there's this much, you don't need to give it to one of us. We're here. We're here to be cooperative with each other. How do we do that? Because fighting against the government doesn't seem to work very well. We're here to say, as you said, many women showed up to advocate for themselves, to advocate for their sisterhood, for their, just for unity, and to advocate for the cause, and still walk away defeated. So how do you arm yourself to keep showing up and say, we know what's there? Maybe holding them accountable in a way that doesn't seem too combative, but at least is aggressive enough to say, we know, and now we're looking for help. We're looking for the support. How can that be done?
You can't do it alone. That's for sure.
Right.
Critical mass makes a difference. It really does make a difference. There's also a labor component to this, as I was talking about the economy, and, when women are targeted, when they are victimized, when they are murdered, they can't show up to work.
Of course not. Yeah.
And therefore, they're not contributing to the economy. So, there are opportunities to partner with unions, with labor organizers, with movements that are invested in women's economic liberation, that are invested in creating a future where children, of survivors can also be economically liberated, right? So it's about knowing those organizations, and it's about making contact and making sure that your community, your neighborhood, your street is aware of what's happening at Queen's Park. Not every bill, but there are some bills where the government will open the doors to deputations. And this is an opportunity where a community can come or apply to come and speak to the government. Now, there are bills that are rammed through without any democracy. They are rammed through with no consultation. But really, it starts at the local level of knocking the door of your member of provincial parliament, knocking the door of your member of parliament, and saying, hey, can I have a meeting? I'm a survivor, or I work with survivors, or I work with young people, in our schools, and I'm seeing concerning patterns around harassment, around bullying, around sexually charged language to describe girls and girls' bodies without their consent. And I want to know, what are you doing? And if you're not doing anything to address this, how can I work with you to address it? It starts with that conversation, right? It starts with that conversation. There are very pragmatic things that I would tell folks that are listening to this conversation. Join your riding association. Before I got into politics, in my 20s, this, that, the other, these aren't things that you're thinking about.
Very true.
When you are a member of your riding association, for whatever party you might be affiliated with, you have a front row seat. You have front row access to your elected official. You could be seeing them weekly. You're
Yeah.
getting all their
Yeah.
information. You know their events. You know where they're going to be. You know what bills they're working on, what bills they're not working on. If they're a good representative, they're going to ask you for ideas of
Absolutely.
legislation that they should be putting forward. And if intimate partner violence isn't on their radar, you put it on it. We need it to be called an epidemic. We
Yes.
need our rape crisis centers, our sexual assault centers, our community organizations, or housing providers that are nonprofit, that are fighting for co-op housing, that are fighting for community land trusts. We need them properly funded and staffed. We need to remove that debt from human trafficking survivors, that student loan debt and credit card debt, and all of these debts that are sometimes created as they're being victimized. Funds that they have not blown, but that
Right.
their pimps, frankly, have stolen from them and have put debts in their name. Right. We need to ensure that our justice system, is properly funded and staffed. And again, properly funded. What does that mean? Operational funding, long-term funding. Not this piecemeal thing where, I present a check and we cut a ribbon and there's a pretty picture of the politician and the CEO and the ED and a few workers. Yes, those pictures are necessary. They show that work is being done.
Yeah.
But let us make it actually authentic work that's being done and not just the work of a photo op.
Agreed. Yes. You bring up a really many great points. When I'm thinking about marginalized communities in this current economic environment, volatile, and I think a lot of the time when things are being reported, there is this air of that's how they do things there, that's how they do it in their culture. And a lot of it is really being instigated now, especially because of the times that we live in. I remember when COVID was sort of at its height and everybody seemed way more sensitive to domestic violence, to intimate partner violence, all of these things because we're in this pandemic. The same things, the same types of situations that we're still living in now. People are losing work. People are closed off together more often in each other's space. People are frustrated because they're scared. They don't know what's going on. That is the environment we're living in now without the label of the pandemic. But so many of those resources have been turned off. And so here we are, like you said, they've done the photo ops, all of this, the check has been cut for that time. It did its job then, but here we are. And what's next, right? So I feel you when you say, let's keep it going, find funding to keep it going. And I love that you are telling our audience to get in touch with your local parliament as much as you can, because even myself, when I was younger, I didn't know anything about politics, and I actually didn't care. I listened to people when they said, oh, politics are all this or that, and I just rolled with it and was like, that's not going to help me. But as I've gotten older, I have learned that every vote matters. There have definitely been rooms that I have been in where it is 5-6. And if that one more vote doesn't come in, everybody walks away. All of the various people who are there to support the cause, but who have not raised their hand, are going to walk away defeated. If just one more person raises their hand, now we're at 6-6, at least we keep the conversation going. If one more person raises their hand, wow, we've come out and achieved the goal. But it is really true that you have to show up. And in a lot of communities, it's unfortunate that the information on how to show up and various routes is not available. So you just have to do it yourself. When you go to an event, say at the community center, local, we're having a new section of the library, and you see your local counselor there, approach them. Show up at that community center, which might be 10 minutes away from you, and approach them, because otherwise you're missing these opportunities that you have shown us are really significant in helping to make change and showing that people care. So I would have to ask you then, because we're going to start wrapping up now. What do you feel like? What hopes do you have in terms of progression? You've brought up so many valid points. You've given us tons of advice. It's up to the people to take it. Again, people are burnt out. They're exhausted. They're fearful. But the truth is, this is what needs to be done to help themselves, to help each other. And so what are you hoping to see? Is there some progress that you're like, well, this has at least started. I feel good about this, and I hope that it goes further. And, I would ask what advice you've given, but you've shared so much already. I really do just want to kind of ask you, what are you hoping to see?
Well, you use the word that I've been saying to myself over and over as my personal mantra, because listen, it's so easy to become apathetic. It's so easy to feel defeated, and there's good reason to feel that way. But those in power who are happy with status quo, those in power who don't really see it as a big issue and don't really care, neither here nor there, if change happens, they are depending on us to be depressed. They are depending on us to give up, to feel defeated, to feel apathy, to not show up, to throw our hands in the air and say, oh, it doesn't matter what I do, things are going to stay the same. They're depending on us to do that. So we have to find hope, which you were talking about earlier, and we have to find optimism. And for me, there were many days when I worked in the legislature when I couldn't find my joy, when things had been so bad in the chamber, or, I was being shut down by a government member, while telling the story of a woman who was sexually assaulted, literally being yelled at, spoken over, all of that. It's in those moments where you have to sort of step back and remember the good that has happened, right?
Yes.
And I will tell you, seeing hundreds of women and children on the lawns of Queen's Park, inside of the building at Queen's Park, in the chambers, fighting for justice, whether that was health care, whether it was mental health care, whether it was funding for sexual assault and rape crisis centers, whether it was demanding the declaration of intimate partner violence and epidemic, all of that and more. That gives me hope and optimism. The numbers of folks who are angry and who are not satisfied with governments of the day and how they are not addressing our crumbling social safety net, that rage inspires me. It inspires me because it means that people are finally, they're at their wits' end. And when we are at our wits' end, we have two options. We can hide under the bed, or we can finally get up and get angry and make organized noise, and put our demands into action. And I'm seeing that. So I'm not seeing the changes as glorious as I'd like to see, but I'm seeing a lot of organizing happening in communities, literally in neighborhoods, buildings organizing, to, of course, provinces and organizations that have come together that are doing incredible work. I will end by saying this. I decided to get into politics because of our education system and our healthcare system. Having worked in our education system for years, having been a patient in our healthcare system, I saw where the gaps were. Right. But it was a speech I gave in 2017, one of the years. It was called "We Must Allow Women and Girls to Be Angry." It was after I gave that speech that I had elected officials come up to me and say, "Why aren't you in politics?" So we have to start asking women to get involved in politics, whether they're elected, whether they're working for politicians, whether they're in the policy back room, wherever. We got to get people to the table working to address intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. So that's where I see hope and optimism. Women are being elected, not as many as we need, but we're getting elected. Now, when we get elected, we got to try and stay elected, and we have to have parties support us so that they can retain us to do the good work that is necessary to help protect our women and children and other community members made marginalized by various levels of discrimination. Yeah. Lots to do, but we're smart, we're women, and we can do hard things.
Absolutely. Dr. Andrew, it has been such a pleasure talking to you today. I can speak for myself, but I'm speaking for the audience when I say it is refreshing to see emotion. And as you're talking about, getting angry and getting into it, I can feel a little bit of the anger there, but what I feel mostly is passion. It
Yes.
is just such a desire for change. And I think that we don't get to see enough of it. I'm certain that there are many women, many people across the board who feel this way, but we don't get to see enough of it. And it's very easy to just kind of be like, again, well, nobody really cares. And, I feel really deeply about this, but what can I do on my own?
Thank you for your work.
Oh, well, thank you. I just feel I was one of those people who, not necessarily this issue, I'm learning so much more as time goes on, but in anything that I felt strongly about, I realized I wasn't putting my voice to it. So it was becoming easy for me to complain about something and to want to see change to it, but I wasn't doing, as they say, being a part of that change. And so I'm trying to do that now. And I hope that other people are influenced and motivated to do the same, because this conversation alone has done that for me. It's made me really say, okay, time to get in there with local and provincial, governments. So I feel like this is the time, and I appreciate you for letting us know that and really sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity.
No, that was absolutely wonderful. We thank you for your time and all of your knowledge and all of your efforts. It's just amazing to speak to someone like you who's doing so much work, adding to the conversation. It's just our honor to have had this time together.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.